9:41. Let's bring you up to date with this morning's front pages of the newspapers.
Now, the Telegraph leads with maths at the heart of the Prime Minister's vision for Britain as they preview what we can expect from Rishi Sunak's big speech later on today.
The Mirror is blaming the Conservative Party for breaking the NHS, accusing the Health Secretary Steve Barclay of passing the buck.
The Express says there's hope at last that train strike misery will end, as a deal to end the walkouts could be within touching distance.
The Sun covers the knife raiders who threatened to stab Olympic cyclist Mark Cavendish in front of his kids at their Essex home.
And I know Mark and Petter, so I wish them the very best. And the Mail pleads, let's not return to face mask madness amid warnings from health chiefs that flu is on the rise.
Well, it is time to go inside the newspapers this morning. We're joined to do so with the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Mellor, and the journalist and political commentator, Emma Wolfe. A happy New Year to both of you.
And
lovely to see you both. Can we start?
You sound almost sincere as you say that. I'm quite touched. I'm going to take my hat.
Oh, stop. Well, it might change my mind depending on how fruity you are this morning, but we hope suitably fruity. Let's start, shall we, with the front of the Star. Where's Rishi, with a play on where's Wally, because he has been notably absent throughout the festive period, and obviously multiple crises going on at the moment, Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. This is crises on multiple fronts. We've got public sector strikes, we've got the NHS apparently in meltdown, and they have a kind of Where's Wally photograph montage on the front of this very serious paper, the Daily Star. You know, people were accusing the Prime Minister really of being negligent, irresponsible and complacent. I mean, he is in there somewhere, apparently. He is in there with a football scarf on. Apparently, I don't know, maybe they've just dropped him in. Did you spot him close up of where he is on the front?
I found Patel.
You found him. Yeah, apparently he's nowhere to be seen. The country really is in quite a state. I think we can all agree on that.
Even I've got better things to do than try and look for him.
Than to look and find him.
Well, look, I was surprised that they stayed with this headline. I mean, it was in the first editions last night, but we got a very late update from Number 10 that the Prime Minister is going to be making a keynote speech today. So, you know, in many ways, he's been working behind the scenes. We understand daily meetings to tackle the NHS crisis as well, going to, I quote, under the bonnet of the situation there. So I suppose, where's Rishi? Well, we're about to see him.
Well, he's been working, you know, surprisingly. Of course, if they'd found that he was on a Caribbean island, there would have been a photograph. You know, there used to be every other holiday with Boris, there would be a photograph of him on a beach somewhere. They haven't got a sort of Rishi's off on holiday while the country goes into implode.
And another
I mean, Parliament isn't back until next week, and I think there's a general sense, though, that, you know, things are just sort of pottering along while the country really grinds to a standstill. Yesterday was meant to be the first day back at work. London was empty.
It really was.
But the extraordinary thing is, the country hasn't really ground to a standstill. People have just chosen different ways of working. I mean, I think, well, if I was running the RMT, I'd be quite frustrated that everything I've tried to do, people are just saying, oh, bothered about that. Empty stations, who cares? I mean, you know, the old days when the railways were vital to this country are long gone.
David, a lot of people are still struggling to get around, I have to say.
Yeah, well, we're all struggling to get around, but we use a bit of imagination.
Lots of people can work from home, but lots of people can't. If you're trying to get into work to stack supermarket shelves or to go and do a cleaning job or whatever, and buses and trains are not working.
The question remains, why pay railway workers much more money when the railway industry is losing £1 million a day? There's no point to it.
Well, David, the numbers don't add up on that, and let's move on to your story next. Compulsory maths, one of Rishi's pet projects. Indeed, that speech today, which will be streamed live on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, is a way of avoiding pesky questions from journalists. But anyhow, compulsory maths for all under 18s, David, good idea or a stinker?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, having good maths teaching in schools has been something that has tended to elude the British over a long period. My father was a maths teacher in a state school, yes, and I think it was a pretty thankless task. But I feel that at the end of it all, you know, it was Blair who said education, 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 and you know he wasn't wrong about everything. And the reality is, that a well-trained workforce is what is needed, and math skills in mathematics are fundamental.
Well, and he's saying more fundamental than ever, because the way the world's changed with the reliance on data and online stuff and statistics, that we're not sufficiently enabling our youngsters to go into the workplace and prosper. I can entirely see the merit in what he's suggesting. I don't really understand how he plans to do it. A, school isn't compulsory till 18, so is he saying it will now be compulsory? B, there aren't any maths teachers, or certainly aren't enough to extend it to there. So how exactly will this work?
That's the big mystery. I mean, we were saying earlier, Emma, that 45% of secondary schools don't even have a specialist maths teacher. They rely on somebody else doubling up. So there's a huge recruitment issue, and that's where his critics are attacking him today, aren't they?
Of course there is. It just seemed, I mean, I have to admit, I was quite glad to give up maths at 16 when we were able to make choices for A-levels instead and drop that. But I also think that, you know, why is this news that we want good basic literacy and I mean, I would add literacy in there as well. Literacy and numeracy skills should be, you know, absolutely what every child acquires before they leave school. But yeah, I mean, it seems odd to come out with this at this time with a country facing bigger issues. It seems like an odd announcement.
What Rishi has to try to prove that he's relevant, you see. I mean, at the end of the day, what is the point of Rishi? What is he doing? Now, I mean, personally, there is often a case that the less you do, the more you do. And allowing the newspapers to determine what a Prime Minister does is not a good policy. Bernard Ingham, who ran Margaret Thatcher's press office, wouldn't let her read the papers. She was forbidden to read the papers. He would give her a digest of things that he thought she ought to know. And the reality is that at the moment, there isn't much, I think, that he can do that would be particularly useful. But the worry for him is, do we need Rishi? Does Rishi
We need a Prime Minister. We need someone to respond to industrial action across the country. I think there's quite a lot.
But it's not for the Prime Minister to run around like a scalded cat, because people are taking industrial action. At the end of the day, the taking of industrial action places a heavy responsibility on those who are taking that industrial action to prove that what they're doing is in the national interest. I don't think they're doing very well.
Well, it depends, does it not? You know, a lot of people will agree with you on the rail strikes, but when it comes to the NHS, there is much more sympathy for nurses. I mean, I spoke to a friend who's a doctor last night. She'd just come off shift. She said she was having to examine people in waiting rooms behind a curtain. It was mortifying for the patients. There were huge waits of people in the waiting room where she was. She was absolutely her morale was rock bottom. She said it had never been worse in the NHS.
People in Scotland being treated in car parks with heaters, children, young children, you know, and we know the panic at the moment about sepsis and strep A and all that. Young children waiting in corridors for 20 hours or whatever.
That brings us on to your next story, actually. And David, a point you made, maybe The Guardian is a newspaper that Rishi Sunak shouldn't be reading today, because they're calling his response to the NHS crisis delusional.
Yeah, and this is quite serious. This isn't just the odd doctor or, you know, anecdotes. This is the BMA, the chair of the BMA, hitting back at number 10.
Well, they're very political, to be fair.
Of course. Of course, it's The Guardian.
Yes, but I actually think hearing from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine almost had more power and more weight. The BMA, you just expect them to be government bashing. It's important to hear what they're saying.
Of course.
But I do think that there's a political point to...
Absolutely, and I'm just reporting what they're saying, which is that they're hitting back at number 10's refusal, or apparent refusal, to admit that there is a crisis in the NHS. Many of us feel that the more, you know, that there are different issues in the NHS than you pour billions in. You could pour double the billions in, and it's still not coming exactly. And that's
agree about that.
Exactly, and where that money goes.
Getting out of bed for to find we agree, because the reality of the matter is money is being tipped into the NHS, and what comes out at this sharp end is not worthy of the amount of money that's poured in. And as for the BMA, look, Health Minister, God, more than 30 years ago. And I remember Ken Clarke saying to me, if you think we have a difficult time as ministers dealing with manual trades unions, they're easy. What is difficult is the BMA, because people tend to believe a doctor. Even though a lot of these BMA people, God knows when they last treated a patient, they'll probably ring and say, no, I was treating a patient this morning. The reality is that being a medical politician is a career. not a career that I ever have personally much approved of.
But Adrian Boyle, he's president of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, he came out with this figure of between 300 and 500 people dying a week
because of delays in the NHS.
In the NHS.
Yeah.
We can't just dismiss that.
Well, we'll never know, though, will we?
Steve Barclay. Well, no, we'll never know.
Know.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the argument's defence in all of this, but there's not much comfort for patients at the moment.
And this is what's so sad. Only it was as simple as putting in more money in. More money has poured in.
It really has.
But the reality is it hasn't produced an efficient and effective NHS. And a lot of that has to do with the doctors themselves.
What's the answers then, David? You know, as a former, heavyweight in cabinets yourself, what's the answer to the mess of the NHS?
When I was health minister, what we were trying to do was to get the best to become the norm. There were so many, for instance, you would find that there were some teams of surgeons who were not doing much in any given week. There were others who were actually working incredibly hard at incredibly complex. Remember comparing, he's still around I'm sure, but not as active as once he was, but there was a wonderful heart surgeon called Magdi Yacoub, and his team were doing more complex surgery than most of what I would call the hammer and chisel boys, the general surgeon. Now, someone's got to do hammer and chisel work, but there's no point in pretending it's as complicated as heart stuff. And how do you make the NHS turn the average into the best? And that's the difficulty.
Well, just retaining them is the problem. It's not even about exceptional standards anymore. It's just trying to keep doctors at any cost. I think there's a statistic at the moment that 60% of currently employed NHS doctors are considering leaving the organisation.
As they have been for the last 30 years. Yes.
Yeah, but I think many of us feel that when you see an individual doctor or nurse, you get excellent care. But this kind of delays, 5 days it takes to discharge someone because a consultant isn't there to sign a letter, or people just being kept in hospital because there's nowhere else for them to go. The kind of inefficiency in the system is just staggering, and that costs millions and billions, as we see, of pounds. But at an individual level,
every time one looks at the amount of money that's spent on bureaucracy and various modish things that they think the NHS needs to be able to deal with, all of that is quite troubling. But the problem is that no one has really got down to the business of making the NHS efficient and effective.
Well, that's a piece of work that's long, long overdue, isn't it? I mean, we can sit here and talk about the cost of procurement, the costs of inefficiency, of equality ministers within the NHS, diversity, net zero, officers. But we've had this conversation for years and years and years. Which government is actually going to grasp the nettle and get over
it's not going to be this government,
and
because
the trouble is,
they won't get re-elected if
ministers try to grasp these things, but then they're removed before they get a chance to. I remember being full of enthusiasm for actually dealing with NHS procurement. But because I discovered that it was cheaper to go down the local Tesco and buy your bog rolls and get the bog rolls ordered through the NHS procurement system. I bet it's the same today. Nothing's ever done about it.
Another health story, Emma, and finally over to you, is the soaring cost of IVF. What's that about?
Yeah, so this is, as we know, IVF is already, this is assisted fertility, it's already extremely expensive. A baby can cost you thousands of pounds if you're successful. And the cost of living crisis has put that dream of having a baby, becoming a parent for many couples, many individuals, completely out of reach. Their savings that they've been saving up. I mean, I know people during the pandemic who were desperate to try for babies. All of their treatment was stopped for years. And when a woman is trying to have IVF, it's usually age-related. I have my baby with IVF. And IVF, and he cost me about £60,000. So it's an expensive thing. And those savings are going to energy bills and, just keeping going.
Yes.
And people are delaying that dream.
Yeah, well, look, we'll try and get into that in more detail in the next hour. We have to wrap the pay-per-view for now, but for now, David Mellor, Emma Wolf, thank you very much indeed. And you found Rishi. He was in there.
I found Rishi.
Look, stay with us. We're going to take a break. After that, we'll talk some more about Rishi Sunak's maths pledge and, of course, the crisis in the NHS. But first of all, your Wednesday forecast.